Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever it is, wherever you are, welcome to the Good Values Podcast. This is the last episode of Season 2. If you haven't already, go back and check out all the other episodes of Season 2 because there have been some fantastic guests, and this episode is no exception. Now, this guest, since this episode, reached out to me, and we are now collaborating on a new podcast that will be launching very soon, so look forward to that. I didn't know this guest before. I have been following his work for a long time. I'm a huge fan of his work. I think he's a fantastic person, an amazing artist. This is my conversation with Richard K. Blades. Okay, would you be able to introduce yourself for the audience, please?
Absolutely. So I'm Richard Blades. I'm a painter. I'm an artist, but my main medium is painting. I also teach painting as well, and I'm situated or based here in Norfolk, UK. However, I've moved around quite a lot, and I've been here for just over a year. But before that, I was in London for 12 years. Before that, I was in Devon, Cornwall for about a decade, but I've travelled widely as well. So this is my home for now.
That's fantastic. Well, with you moving, does this mean that the majority of your work that I've seen, is that based in Norfolk, or is there seascapes from Devon that I've seen on your account as well?
Well, it's interesting because I tend to work from my memory and imagination. So even though the skies here, in particular the skies and the sea and the landscape is very influential and feeds into my work, I must say the majority of my work really comes from memory. I think having travelled quite a lot and moved around quite a lot, I've always had this ability or desire to kind of absorb things, to absorb experiences. So you very rarely see me out painting plein air. What I tend to do is I will walk around and absorb the experiences and then come back to the studio to paint based on those. Never from photographs directly, but I do take a lot of photographs just to sort of re-trigger those memories sometimes. So, in my work, what I try to do is try to sort of create something that is not vernacular, that isn't location specific, that somewhere, so somebody lives in America or Cornwall or Norfolk or North Wales, and they can see in my work something that relates to them. So I'll never put sort of landmarks that are specific to Norfolk in there. And it's interesting, the majority of collectors of my work live in the USA, so it's that sort of universal appeal I'm looking for, that they can see in the painting something that they can relate to. However, it's directly informed by my own experience of the landscape.
That's really impressive. I mean, especially, I've noticed how well you render clouds, and I find those to be something which is incredibly delicate to try to get the balance of the shape of the cloud and the transparency and the kind of layers of a cloud. And how's that developed? Is that from your imagination, or is that a lot of help with reference?
It's pretty much all from imagination. I say imagination, but all imagination is informed. You sort of ask a child to paint or draw a cloud, and you get a kind of a nice little fluffy cloud there. But that too is informed, and whether that's informed from looking at the clouds or seeing it somewhere else in media. For me, I look at clouds a lot, but it's always a disaster when I try to sort of paint what I see. First of all, because they move so quickly. So you mix the colours for this cloud, and before you know it, it's changed. The form has changed. The colours have changed. But it's relying on that sense of knowing them and looking at them and seeing them. That they are usually shaped in a certain way. That they take on a dimension of usually tonally darker at the bottom, lighter on the top, but it depends. Big influence of mine is John Constable. He's the master of clouds, of course. Yeah. And when I was in London, I spent a lot of time on Hampstead Heath, where Constable painted, and he was observing clouds, but as I say, they move so quickly. You have to rely to some extent on your memory and imagination to render them. I feel I've made a breakthrough, definitely in the past year or so, of being able to interpret or sort of create impressions of these clouds based on brushstrokes and palette knife marks. And even though they're not photorealistic representations of them, they've got that impressionistic element that makes them nonetheless recognisable as clouds.
Yeah, so. Absolutely beautiful. Sorry. Do you have a preferred time of the day to capture a seascape or a landscape painting?
So for me, it's always, especially atmosphere and light, early morning or late evening. For me, and that's why you'll often see those pinks and violets and peachy colours in my work. Those two times of the day are just magical for me. And it's interesting that I don't tend to paint at those times of day, because I'm out absorbing it all in and taking it all in. And there's just something absolutely magical about that light when the sun is low enough to create those sort of pinky, violety, peachy colours. When it's high in the sky, you're getting the light on top of the clouds more. So, things aren't quite as interesting for me. But as soon as it's a little bit lower, whether it's going up or down, you're getting that light coming upwards like that. So it's creating these incredible tones.
Yeah. I found that through my journey of painting and drawing, it appears to be a series of epiphanies as you develop and increase your knowledge. What's something which you've learned which you hadn't discovered until you were more experienced at your craft?
That's an interesting question. I mean, there's quite a few, and of course we have these each day. I think the thing is that you can leave a painting quote unquote unfinished in the early years. I think things weren't complete, and there'd be a certain amount of tension around that. But I've learned now that things don't have to be finished, and that almost the looser and unresolved they are, the more people can project their own kind of feelings into it. So that's a massive one, really, that you almost don't have to resolve the image. The image kind of resolves itself, because you as the artist sees, you know every little step of it. And usually as artists, we see the negative parts in the painting rather than the positives. That's just part of it, I'm afraid, and it doesn't go away. But you've got to learn to relax a little bit and just let it be. I also have realised as well that within repetition, there's also a huge and vast scope for experimentation, diversity, nuance, all of those types of things. So, I paint often the same thing all the time, but they're very, very different, each one. So, especially with contemporary painting and art, whereas in the past that, you would get someone, let's say Picasso, for example, he learned to draw like the old masters, he'd done landscapes, he'd done still lives, portrait, the whole kind of thing. But I think nowadays in contemporary art practice, one can just do the same thing, however, have variations and nuance and diversity within that approach. So if you look on Instagram now, and some of this I think is to do with our own bandwidth as viewers, that we like to see the recognisable in an artist, to say, I know who this is by. If I was just constantly trying to paint different styles all of the time, I not only kind of lose the core of my own visual identity, but it would also sort of confuse collectors and buyers. So that's a big thing as well. But I've learned just to have my subject and embrace it completely, and make that as part of my identity. Don't try and be everything. Don't try and compare yourself to others. So.
Yeah. What is it that you value about art?
I think, for me, and I've always been interested in art. And for me, it is. Let me think. Visual art in particular, and I'll talk about painting. I've always been a visual person, but I'm also very interested in poetry, poetics, aesthetics, those types of things. And for me, painting is a kind of a visual poetry, that you are able to, as the artist, sort of convey something that other people can relate to and have that transcendent experience to some extent, and whether that is just in an aesthetic sense, in a spiritual sense, however it is that people can look at your painting and think, I can imagine myself in that place. I've been to a place like that. So it's that power of art really as a form of communication that is beyond words. It's just that sort of, it's difficult to describe, but for me, that's what art means. It means that the artist is able to capture things that relate to people on that level of experience. In particular, the landscape, for me, a lot of it's about longing, about wanting to be there, of being there, of recognising that sense of space.
I read that you started painting in your 20s. Is that correct? And what was it that made you make that decision? Because it's quite a leap into the uncertainty of being an artist. So how did that come about?
So I was always artistic, and as a kid, used to draw all of the time. Then as a young teenager, I used to copy album covers, sort of draw those. And I was thinking about this the other day. I actually had on my wall in my teenage bedroom this huge painting, the doors, so the band of the doors. So there's an album cover of Jim Morrison, sort of just, like that on there. Yeah. So I painted this on my wall on a big bit of board. And I also had one of Peter Tosh from Bob Marley and the Wailers, sort of sitting there smoking a pipe. So I was sort of fascinated by visual representations of things. things. So, but then I became more interested in travelling, and I was reading the beatnik poets at the time, Jack Kerouac and Ginsberg and all of that, and I became fascinated then by writing. So I went off travelling relatively young age, about 16, 17, hitchhiked to Amsterdam, and kind of then spent years travelling Canada, Australia, India, hitchhiking everywhere. And at that time I wanted to be a writer. So that's where my creative attention, but I didn't get any writing done, it's just sort of experiencing life. Yeah. But then I was living in Canada at the time and moved to down to Plymouth to study glass blowing initially, but then went to art college down there. Got fascinated by visual art again, and then got a studio in Cornwall, sort of overlooking the sea. I was very fortunate to be mentored by and make friends with two professional painters, they're Cornish painters, Heath Hearn and Katie Brown, and they sort of taught me in a way, not directly in a sense, but how to be an artist, to have a studio, to turn up and to not do it in this kind of bohemian way where I was before, sort of thinking I was an artist, but consumed with all of these other sort of hedonistic kind of pursuits. So they really gave me that idea of that you can be an artist, and being inspired then by the landscape, the sea, the culture of Cornish art, St Ives and all that. I started on my journey of becoming an artist, but I was useless at painting. So it took many, many years to learn how to do it. And that is sort of, I went to uni. I've got a BA in fine art, but it was mainly theory based. And I was kind of happy by that because I could just read about art history and absorb that. And in the background, I was kind of learning to paint. So.
And does music still factor into your mindset and your artistic drive a lot?
Music, yeah, absolutely, yeah. I mean, you'll see some of the titles I use have got sort of, depends. Some have got little music references, or if I'm listening to something in particular when I finish a painting, I'll kind of. I was listening to Chopin. I think one is called Listening to Chopin.
Wow.
Yes, it does. I've got Spotify on all of the time. And, whether it's me listening to bands I listen to the most are sort of Cure and Smiths and bands like that, all the way to sort of real kind of minimal contemporary classical, Max Richter. And occasionally I'll put some sort of, what do you call it, like intelligent electronic music on.
Ah, very good, yeah.
And so, intelligent dance music, as they call it. But anything, I love music, always have. It's a massive, massive part. And it's just depending on my mood. Again, sometimes I'll come in here and I'll just want something that's really uplifting and immersive. Sometimes it's that kind of more poetic stuff, The Cure, for example. And other times it's just completely tranquil.
Yeah, that's lovely. And how long would you say it takes generally from start to finish of a painting? Is there a time frame you set yourself or that you found it takes?
No. Some take 15 minutes. They just happen. Some take months, because I keep sort of going back to them. Usually the best ones are done in 15 minutes, really? Strangely. And I'm not talking like a big painting done in 15 minutes, but a lot of the smaller ones, anywhere between 15 minutes and an hour, because I've come back to the studio and I've got that I've got that inspiration, and it just feeds directly out. Whereas others, so for example, I've just got this little one here, so that probably took me about half an hour to do.
That's incredible. That's a beautiful piece.
So it totally depends. Some take that little bit more of a struggle to get what I'm looking for. Some I'll have tucked away for months, sometimes years, and then get it out and just do something and it works.
How important do you find framing a piece, like finding the right frame for the hue of the painting? How important is that to you?
It's really important. It's really important. I posted on Instagram yesterday. I'm working with a local framer who's his name's Jeff Peach, and I mean, he's worked for some really big galleries and very experienced guy. And I'm now working with him because I trust he knows what he's doing in that sense of framing something, that the framer also has a similar eye to an artist, that they know they're tuned in with that. Regarding frames, I like minimal frames, especially in neutral white colours, because the work is so colourful and textured. I want the frame to be just a facilitator of the impact of the painting is facilitated by the frame, rather than the frame sort of saying, "Hey, look at me. I'm worthy of being looked at too," with gold trim and all that kind of stuff. It's not what I'm interested in personally. I did go through a stage of making my own frames.
Really?
Yeah, but it takes so much time. So now it's worth paying for and having that dialogue with someone who is a master of their craft, and then you get what you want.
Lovely. Well, another thing I'm curious about is, do you have a go-to palette? So is there a select color palette that you use to create your paintings, preferred colors?
Not really. Now, this sort of goes against my teaching practice, because I teach a limited palette. So, I usually start with just a primary palette, and then maybe go to a split primary palette, or primary palette with then burnt sienna added to it. And that's really because that's how I learned to do it. I remember I was living in London at the time, and when I really started to get into it, and not just buying any paints, I would go to some of the art shops and just see these beautiful old Holland oil paints and Michael Harding, and I thought, I have to get every tube, every colour, which cost you thousands of pounds.
Yeah.
And I found when I was getting these colours, I'd become quite sort of disappointed, because now what do I do? So I remember consciously saying, I'm going to go minimalist on this. So I basically just locked all of these colours away and bought 3 primary colours, and just learned how to mix from those 3 primaries. So I think at the time it was like cadmium red, cadmium yellow, and ultramarine blue. And I was getting really good at mixing all of the colours just from those 3, learning about secondaries, tertiaries, complementaries, and things like that. But then I was starting to see the cadmium red. I couldn't make the violets I wanted. So then substituting the cadmium red for, say, a quinacridone rose, I was realising I could get the violets, but then I couldn't get those lovely opaque reds that you get with the cadmium. So what I do then is just explore then having the cadmium and the quinacridone, And then equally with the yellows, so it went from this basic limited palette, and then, literally reaching its limits and realizing there's certain things I can't do with it. Let's add something. And then from there, building up. Now, what I tend to do now, I'm much more chaotic. I've got lots of different colours around and I've just grabbed them, but the fundamentals are there. But I've learned how to mix colours from that basic primary and then split primary to know that I can just sort of grab anything now. What I do a lot is I work in colour triads, which I really enjoy. So again, it's based on the fundamentals of a primary palette, but I mix them up. So for example, you could think of a high key primary palette, which would be, as I said before, say a cadmium red light, a cadmium yellow light, and an ultramarine blue. It's relatively high key, those colours. But within a colour triad, what you could do, you can say, well, I can use any yellow, any red and blue. So a lot of my seascapes are painted through yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and ultramarine blue. And the blue's always a tricky one. So that's a triad there. You've got those things, and it's basically a primary palette. But then, I might change my mind and say, okay, I'm going to use a raw sienna as my yellow, and I'm going to use I'm just trying to think, Mars brown as my red, Mars orange, and then I'm going to use a Payne's grey as my blue. So again, you're working on that basics of a three colour primary palette. But the mixes you're going to get out of it is crazy, and you can do that like sort of ad infinitum with all of the different colours you got. Yellow oxides, use that, or equally you could use Naples yellow as your yellow, and always move them around. Sometimes I do it just based on a complementary mix. So I painted a sort of a rising moon for someone whose favourite colours are kind of a green and then say like a crimson. So I painted the whole painting out of viridian green and quinacridone rose and white, of course, because you can kind of get violet out. They're complementary, so you're getting all of these. I'm fascinated by colour, by the way, these different palettes. But if you were to look now at the amount of sort of scruffy tubes and paint everywhere in my place, you wouldn't think I was that fussy about it.
Now, I was told by my art mentor years ago that in reality, what we see is the majority is tertiary colours, and that primary colours don't truly exist in nature. Have you found that to be the truth as well? Is that something which...
Pretty much. It depends. I mean, especially when you're sort of painting sunsets and stuff like that. If they're going to exist, they're going to exist there. But it's interesting, and this is where I tap in again to the idea of working to some extent from imagination, that we can amplify or turn down certain colours based on our will. Observation for me is very important, but also creative license is very important too. So I'm very interested in those contrasts between more muted and tertiary colours, and then with these pops of primary colours. And yeah, it's a fascinating thing. I'm greatly influenced by Giorgio Morandi. Do you know Morandi? So
I don't know.
I think you'd really like it, especially because you work sort of in that sense of line drawings and stuff. But so Giorgio Morandi, Italian painter, and this also relates to me talking about repetition and variety within repetition. So Giorgio Morandi made these sort of vessels and pots and stuff, or collected them, and he would just arrange them in different compositions and just paint them over and over. But he would use often these very muted greys and earthy colours, but then he would often have these pops of yellow or orange or red in there. And for me, it's about that, which you don't tend to see in nature, apart from the more kind of sort of exaggerated elements of nature. I'm just thinking of flowers and things like that. You do get that, but it's very interesting with colour. Do we paint what we see exactly, what is represented there, or do we have that little bit of license to play with it and say, here I am going to put that pop of a primary colour?
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because people who've watched this channel will know that I always say my philosophy is you learn the rules and then you break them, because as soon as you know the rules, you can break them liberally, and if you don't know the rules, you will abide by and break those rules without the knowledge of doing so. How do you feel about embedding structure in the student before they can truly express their own perception and kind of vantage points?
I think it's very important. However, there is an element of sort of putting some students off. Look, I'm not that great at drawing, I happily admit it, but a lot of that is because I don't use that muscle very much to draw. For me, the foundations to the fundamentals are, as I was saying earlier, about, because I teach painting, and I teach painting in a similar way to I paint, expressive landscapes, impressionistic, abstract. For me, the fundamentals and the framework is the colour and the tone. So that's why I'm very liberal about everything else, but quite strict around those elements of like, these are the colours we're using. And then I found once you give people that foundation, that then, you just see them blossom in that sense. I do really believe in structure and order, and I think that actually does give then the best framework for freedom and self-expression. So you say with jazz music, for example, you've got this sort of jazz trumpeter or guitarist or whatever, and he's going off all over the place, like, you think, where's he going? But then drops right back into that sort of framework again, that jazz style and rhythm. I think, art and painting can be very similar. Whatever the framework you choose, it could be compositional drawing, tonal rendering, that your values are there. But once you've kind of got that, it means then those spaces for self-expression and nuance and all of those things can be there, because if you feel like you're losing yourself and going off track, you can always just bring it back to those fundamentals. I'm very into philosophy, and I read a lot of Nietzsche's ideas when I was at uni, Nietzsche's ideas on art and aesthetics. So he talks about the Greek cultures of Apollo and Dionysus. So Dionysus is the god of chaos and disorder and intoxication and all of these kind of things. And Apollo is the god of structure, sobriety, order, rigidness. Now, if you have art that is all Apollo based, it's pretty boring. It's too rigid, it's too structured. If you have art that is too Dionysus based, it's chaotic, it's all over the place. However, a combination of the two, you get some very interesting stuff. You've got the structure and the framework of that sort of more conservative, let's say, way of looking at art. But then within that, you have the chaotic kind of spontaneous beauty of that Dionysus kind of thing. And I found this really, really interesting. So in my work, you will see, I've got my horizon. It could be 2/3 up, it could be 2/3 down. I've got these things. That's my Apollo, that's my structure and my order. But then what happens all around it is, that more spontaneous and free-flowing stuff.
Well, I've seen as well with your ability to render form in your still life paintings, which are beautiful as well, and you managed to keep this loose impressionistic level of finish to them. And what is it that you'd say is the difference in achieving that from the landscapes that you normally paint?
I don't paint enough of them. Is one thing, and I think because it is a different mindset. It's more intimate and close up, and much more based on observation. With a still life, I will kind of I will draw it out. I will take photographs. I take different angles and compositions and get the sketch right, and then do the loose painting on top. But I'm looking more at my subject, whereas the landscapes, because they're the framework for them is pretty basic. Again, either 2/3 up is the horizon or 2/3 down, straight line. There, all I have to worry about is really that line. Whereas a still life, you've got diagonals, you've got verticals, horizontals, and all of those kind of things. I do enjoy painting them, but I do find them much harder to paint.
Yeah, it's less from imagination, I suppose, isn't it?
Yeah, I think once I've got that the basis for it, the composition, the drawing, I can then be much more loose and expressive on top. I also find as well with the still lives that I'm sort of quite fussy about how I get the composition. So, I'm always sort of setting it up and then thinking, no, it doesn't look right, this, here. So I end up getting a little bit stressed about it, but fussy. And most of my still lives have come spontaneously, where I've seen some flowers on the riverbank here, some wildflowers, and I've just thought, oh, that looks like that. I might paint it. And in the lockdown as well, I've done quite a few still life paintings because we couldn't go anywhere. So.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask as well about the process of your landscape painting. Is there a combination of brush and palette knife, or what does it use? Yeah, it is. Because it looks as though you have a thin layer to start off with and build up the thickness. Is that right? Or?
That's right, yeah. And it depends. Sometimes I'll just do a purely palette knife painting when I feel like it. But usually it is a sort of a combination of the both. It depends on what surface I'm using, but I will often prime, whether it's MDF boards, plywood, or even a board canvas. I will often make a mix of white acrylic paint or gesso and marble dust, calcium carbonate, and mix it into a sort of a kind of a gritty kind of gesso, and then just brush that over the surface and let that dry, and then tone it with burnt sienna, oil burnt sienna. I find that this, and this is how I do oil painting, it's separate to my gouache painting. What it does, it gives me that texture then to work on. So when I put a brush stroke, and I rarely mix my paint with turbs or any medium, I just use paint straight out of the tube. And I'll start to brush those initial composition tonal layers on with the brush, and then come in with a palette knife over top. But because it's got that sort of textured foundation, it kind of does half the work for you in a sense. In regards to gouache painting, which I've only really been doing recently properly, that is just on paper, and that is all brushwork. It's just so difficult to handle with a palette knife, it dries too quick.
Well, there's also the added difficulty of, if it's too wet, it will remove the layer below it with gouache, isn't it? So it's a very disciplined and kind of strategic application, I suppose.
Yeah, but it's similar in a way to oil. Well, I mean, I was taught, well, I wasn't taught, but I read and whatever about gouache, that it's just basically an opaque watercolor. That's what I was told. But I'm not a watercolor painter. I do it sometimes, but I'm not that interested in it. But because I'm an oil painter, I thought, well, I'm going to approach gouache like I do oil, i.e., what they would call fat over lean. So, thin layer, slightly thicker layer, because it dries so quickly, you're building it up. The good thing about it, though, is that, say if I built up a layer of gouache, let me just grab one and I'll demonstrate. I've got a couple here. I've got this one, so this is gouache here. Now, there's a combination there of very kind of more fluid brushwork, and then thicker areas more impasto. The great thing about it is I can build this up, like I was saying, through layers, and then, because horizons are very important to me, so I can build it up. Then I can take a wet brush much later on in the process, or damp brush, and just blend that. So it's thicker paint underneath, but because it's alive, I was able to do it. Now, this is one of the first recent ones I've done. You can see it's quite thick. Quick, and it's quite thick, and there's quite a lot of layers. But again, around here, what I've done, I've just taken that damp brush towards the end and just lightly blended it to do a very interesting medium, much misunderstood. I really like it. One of the downsides, and I almost quite happily make it my primary medium, is one of the downsides, it's very hard to do it on a large scale, because first of all, the tubes come about that big. I'll slap it on, but also because it dries so quickly, some of those sort of brush marks you can't get on a larger scale. But I'm experimenting at the moment.
Brilliant. I was going to ask as well, with your horizon line, is that a steady hand? Is it a case of cutting in? I mean, how do you achieve such a beautiful kind of stroke?
Yeah, just a steady-ish hand.
Oh, well done.
They're never completely straight. I remember doing it with a ruler once, when I first started doing these kind of landscapes, and ruler, masking tape, but it just never looked right.
Yeah.
It looked too straight.
Yeah. It's a lovely effect. And also I noticed how the knowledge of the tonal equivalence between the horizon of the sea and the sky, that's an earned knowledge. How long did that take for that epiphany to hit you through observation? When was that?
I think it just evolved. A massive part of it has been living here, because it's very, in the part of Norfolk I am, we're near the Wash, so it's that bit that goes in, if you look on a map, sort of in, and it's very tidal. Just like the river here, there's parts where you can't even see where the sea is. It's just this sort of strange other world of reflections and horizons. So a lot of it's been looking at that and absorbing it. But some of it's just been technical and through experimentation. But I teach this as well, where I say to people, if they're doing say a seascape, for example, that the furthest thing away from us is the horizon. So there we can have it nice and softly blended. If we're working in pasto, in that sense. Now the closest thing to us is going to be the shore. So whether it's rocks or a beach or the waves crashing. So if we're going to use texture, we use it there. Now, regarding the sky, if we're going to have clouds, the clouds that are towards the top of the painting, you can also have texture in there, because the shore and those top clouds are the closest things to us. The horizons are furthest away, so that's where that blend comes in. And what it does, just by getting that blend, whether it's with a brush or I'm doing my sort of finger there, because in an oil painting I often do it with my finger, is it pushes it right back. So you get that sense of distance and space. Yeah. And that's just that little technical thing that I learned, over time.
It's lovely. I mean, things like that are true knowledge, which I think it's sadly not taught as I want it to be. Just as I would say to students, if you look at a clear blue sky, the lightest part is lower. It's not higher in the sky, it's lower in the sky. And there's a scientific reason, but there's an artistic observation before the scientific explanation, I think, was available. And that's
absolutely
just it's learning to see, I think, is painting and drawing is to see the world properly.
And the more you see and the more you try to render these things or capture them, the more you see. It's strange. Some of my students, I do different forms of teaching, so I run workshops which are more one-off. I do online tutoring, and I do two mornings a week teaching locally here, just in a village hall, and with regular people. And I've got about, say on average, about 10, 11 for each on the Thursday and the Friday morning. And I try to limit, I've got a workshop this weekend, and so I just try to limit my teaching, ideally just to those 2 mornings a week. But we've sort of gone through this whole journey together, been with them now for just over a year, each group, and seeing that evolution and the amount of them that say now, and they send me photos, oh, did you see the sky tonight? So that how they've become so much more attuned to looking and seeing. How do you get that little bit of kind of, strange bluey, yellowy, greeny colour that's just, and it's, so the more you do it and the more you look, the more you see, and the more you try and sort of translate that into what you're doing.
Has there ever been a sky which you see where you think it's beautiful, but it wouldn't work in a painting because of? Sometimes I see paintings and I think I know that there are skies like that, but it's not my style of painting necessarily, and there are preferred executions of a painting for skies. Has that ever happened to you?
Yeah. I mean, again, I see a lot of paintings myself, and can tell they've been copied from a photograph, basically. So photography can capture things that the painting can't, and painting can capture things that photography can't. It's that sort of thing. There are sort of certain scenes, certain skies that are just too difficult. So, for example, you never see me painting sunbeams. I think it's very, very difficult to do, and I just don't think they work in paintings in the way that they do in photography or in real life. The sunbeams are magical things, but it's sort of translucent light, and trying to render that in a material form, i.e. paint, is very difficult. Can work in watercolour. So I'd say sunbeams. What's tricky also as well is where, and I've been trying to do that, I've done one recently which was more of a success, where you've got a real grey kind of sky, and then you've just got this sort of bit of flash of yellow or orange where the sun is. That's very difficult to do as well. And also, aesthetically in a painting doesn't necessarily work. So yeah, I mean, there's lots, and sometimes, I mean, I'll see a nice sort of cloudy sky or nice whatever it is, and just think there's not enough drama in it for me. It's nice and stuff like that, but for me, I always need that kind of drama, and if I have to create it myself, I will. So you will often see my paintings, I've either usually from the right hand side coming in, sometimes from the left hand side. I'll often have a cloud shadow coming across, and really that's a device rather than a representation to create that sense of tension, that the painting is, or the scene is going on beyond the square that we see it through. One of the big mistakes sky painters can make is trying to cram everything into this square, because we don't see the world like that.
No.
You look out the window and it's cut off.
One of the things I've discussed with people about the difference between plein air and photographic reference is that plein air is life moving in time, sifting away, and then photographs is a fragment of a second where everything's still and there's no movement. Is there anything else which makes you less inclined to use photographs as reference? Is there anything else that I'm missing about the kind of inherent difference between experiencing life and using a still image?
I mean, like you said there, it is it's a very unnatural thing to have life completely crystallized like that the scene is trapped in time. So that is one element. There are difficulties with plein air painting, as I mentioned before. I mean, you see the most amazing clouds, you've got your head down, you're mixing the colour, you look up and it's gone.
Yeah.
It's very frustrating. Yeah. So even a plein air painter has to rely on memory. and you can imagine a fast-moving scene. Unless they work really, really fast, it's very difficult because you could be there all day, chasing what you see. So they have to rely to some extent on memory. The other thing about photography is that I think it is, and I must say the majority of people that do come to my classes and workshops who are painters do work from photography, and they get extremely frustrated because they can't make it look as good as a photograph, and they're there trying to get every detail, and I think it's very bad for the artist's confidence, the artist's ability to evolve, because you've got this weight of the photography getting in your way. In the kind of, say, in the style that I'm painting, and say, now there is photorealism, there's all of that kind of stuff, which is, fair enough, you have to some extent. I remember I went to locally this talk by Andrew Graham Dixon, him,
I know the name.
He's like a TV art guy. He's done some really fascinating programs. Excuse me, got some water. And he was saying this sort of anecdote about an art school where it's on 4 stories. In the bottom, you've got the life model and all of the first year new students gathered around drawing. On the second floor, you've got like the more experienced students. And what they're doing is they're going down to look at the life model and then go back to their easels on the second floor to draw. And then on the third floor, you've got the third year students, and they're going down less often, seeing the life, going back and going. And then on the top floor, you've got the master who goes down once a day, sees the life and then goes up, and is, because the memory and that imagination and that stuff is there. So it's interesting when we think in that sense about these things, about how we capture things. So I always vary it, but a lot in my workshops and classes, I'll take in photographs that I've taken around here, but I'll only let them look at it once, to try and get that. Another thing I do is, and I do this myself, is look at the photograph, but then just with the pen, draw the basics, just where the horizon is, so where the sun is, and where the clouds are coming from, and then turn the photograph off.
Yeah.
So it's relying on that source material, but it's also rejecting it as well. And then you can be free to paint and to use the medium as it should be used, as its own medium, and not as a sort of a substitute or a copy of it.
That's fantastic. I suppose another thing which I'd like to know, before I get to my final 2 questions that I ask everyone, is one thing that I like to ask artists is, especially ones like yourself, is if you teach your students any tricks, and by tricks I just mean one of the things that it's kind of reality tricks. It's not a trick. It's more like as things recede into the distance, they become blue. There's kind of a blue hue to things, and that's a trick which, if you don't already observe that and know that, it's great to gift that to someone. Is there any tricks that you kind of can kind of share with the audience that you've learned is successful for painting?
The one I mentioned earlier, that your horizon is going to be the furthest thing away. Let's say you're doing a seascape, as I mentioned before. So there you kind of blend it. The paint is softer, smoother, more blended. And then the closer to you, the larger things are. So that's where you can really like trowel on. Let's think of another one. It's difficult to think off the top of my head with this.
Yeah, sorry to put you on the spot with that one.
No, absolutely. I think as well that, like I said about the clouds coming in from let's have a look. Flash has gone again. So you can see here that, I've got this now. This is purely a device to create that sense of tension and depth in the painting. That cloud, is carrying on out there. And what is over here is being mirrored or contrasted with what's happening here. Dark, light. So you're getting that sense of space. Now imagine if I took that out and then made this just in the centre there. Well, you'd have a really flat kind of image. But by having these devices in dark, light, each coming in from the edge, you're creating that sense of space, of tension, of perspective, without there even being really anything on the horizon to create that perspective. So we could have a church over here, or let's think a boat, for example, as a sea, so a boat mast. So your eyes will be going there. Now, how do you create that when you don't have that kind of, say, vertical reference point? You do it by thinking of things in almost like triangles in a way. Triangle there, triangle coming across there, triangle there, triangle coming across there. So
yeah, I love that. That's amazing.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing is, and I've got into a bit of a, not so much a habit because it's what I paint, but talking about focal points. Now here I've just done this, and it's such a small painting, so it's really hard to do this tiny little moon. But if I take that out, now, it's a painting, and again, it's got that little bit of sense of depth, but it's not as much as that other one. It's much more sort of flatter. But by putting that in there, you've got that focal point. So, and again, it's very idiosyncratic to me to have these suns and sometimes moons in there, but it's also a device to create that sense of space and depth. So whether you are painting, say, trees that you're interested in, move that tree around, get it as this thing that's within your space, but creates that sense of depth with it. And again, you see that other trick of like what's further away is hazier, it's more blended, it's what's closer, which this is closer to us than that. More body, more texture.
That's fantastic. No, thank you. That's brilliant. That's really enlightening. Now,
my pleasure.
There are two questions. These were from my art mentor. For about a year, I spent this time with this woman who was a professional painter, and she would always ask me these questions every day, and I'd see her almost every day, and I'd be drawing and painting every time I'd see her, and she'd ask me these questions. And I always like to ask artists because I think these are true for people who it's their job to observe and the world and retain certain things that they find that they appreciate. The first one is, what's the most beautiful thing you've seen today?
Now, when I was driving here, it's the sky. It's a relatively listless sky. It's cleared up a little bit, but it was interesting. The kind of the clouds were it was relatively fast moving, and the clouds were just sort of hovering over the top, and it was a high tide slowly going out when I got here. So I get the sparkle of the light on the water. So that's the most beautiful thing.
That's incredible. And the other one is a double barrel question, and that's, what do you like and what don't you like about your own artwork?
So the thing I don't like about it is it depends, you know. It's more like what I don't like about a specific painting, and then I'll try to remedy that. I think, you know, in general, what I don't like about it is I'm always dissatisfied with paintings, and this is natural for artists. I'd usually say if I'm 60% happy with it, then that's good. That's like top marks. Okay, if I'm 60% happy. So really, it's nothing in particular that I don't like, but it's more that frustration of not really being able to capture exactly what I want to capture. But that's why I turn up every morning and carry on painting. Again, I'll often say this to my students. I've done a little exhibition of their work last year, and you know, it looked great. It's really nice, and it's the first time they exhibited, and it's all together. And each one kind of come in, and I said, "Oh, your work looks great." And talking to them individually, and they said, "But it doesn't look as good as everybody else's." You know, so,
oh wow!
And the amount of them that said that, it was really interesting, because we can't see our work objectively. We can never see it as a viewer. So for me, it's just that thing that every artist has, where there's always an element of dissatisfaction going on. But that's why we carry on painting, because we want in that next painting to capture what we lacked before. I mean, read Van Gogh's letters to see that he's painting masterpieces and absolutely dissatisfied with them. So, you know, I can't pick anything in particular that I don't like about my work, but it's just holistically dissatisfaction. What I do like about it is more in how it's evolved, and how now I've kind of found my subject matter, and can be recognised through it. And it kind of just happens in a way that, you know, for people sort of see my work and they kind of know it's by me. And that's such an amazing feeling, because you know, I think for years, like every artist, we kind of cannot help but be influenced by other painters, and you know, we're doing sort of something, and then you suddenly see that influence coming into the work. But I now feel I can nod to those influences, but it also be mine, and that's a great feeling to have. So that's what I like about it. It's not something specific, it's just more again.
That's fantastic. And the last thing is there anywhere that we should direct the audience to look at your work, or, you know, websites, social media, anything that you'd like people to check out?
Yeah. So I'm mainly active on Instagram. That's the place, and it is, what is it? At richard.k.blades_art. That's my Insta. So I post most there. My website as well is Richard K. Blades Artist .co.uk. I think that's it. But they're the main places. But I would recommend most mostly Instagram, because that's, where I put my work, but put little adverts out for collections, or workshops I'm doing, or interviews like this.
And do you have any other exhibitions coming up this year?
I don't currently, and this is something interesting, that I do work with galleries, mainly a gallery down in Cornwall. I've been working with a gallery recently here, but I'm so stubborn and independent that I kind of sort of do my own thing. I was releasing collections via my website. Every couple of months I do a collection, but now I'm tending just to put works on there, and they're selling just like that. So I'm kind of still trying to work out, what to do. What I'm looking to do is to actually start doing a little bit of curating, and I want to bring a few artists together to put on some shows, and to do some pop-up events. And again, it's that thing of me sort of being quite independent, and I like the curatorial control over my work and what I'm doing, and and I don't, galleries are important, exhibitions are important, I think, but Instagram has changed everything, and being online has changed everything, and I'm just looking at new ways of showing work, but having it be very, very sort of narrative driven, in a sense. So that's what I'm planning at the moment.
Well, I suppose if that changes, it'll be updated on your Instagram. All of the links will be in the description below as well. I'll put all of the links to your website, your Instagram, and I do encourage the audience to go and check out and support Richard's work. It's fantastic. I've been a long time supporter. I love it. So go and have a look. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. You've been a fantastic guest, and I appreciate your time.
Yeah, anytime. I'll come back anytime. So.
Oh, I'd love that. Okay, so that is the episode done. I really enjoyed it. I thought he was so open and really just very sincere with everything that I asked him. I thought his work was beautiful. It was a complete joy to edit, and I look forward to working with him in the future. Now, we'll be announcing the new podcast, both of us progressively, as it ramps up towards the launch date. I've edited several episodes already, and we are continuing to book guests and kind of get ideas together so that we can expand and build this new platform. I'll be advertising it on this channel, but I won't be posting the episodes. It will have its own channel, so I will announce that when it is the time. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Please support Richard. All the links are in the description below. So support him and go and check out his work. He really deserves it. If you can support this podcast, I'd really appreciate it. This channel needs your support. And by clicking subscribe, it won't make very much difference to you, but it'd make all the difference in the world to me. And liking this episode is another big thing, which it's only a click of a button, but to me, it means the world of difference between engagement with an audience and just passive viewers, which I understand and I appreciate. If you're not signed in, you don't really want to. But there we are. If you can support it, it'd be greatly appreciated. But thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next season.